I'd like to share a little bit about what a trauma trigger can feel like. This is essentially a CPTSD experience, so complex post-traumatic stress disorder. When we've gone through relational trauma earlier in our lives, it's most likely that we're going to have triggers that come from very different but specific sources that create a very complex response in us. And because it's so complex, we can find it hard to decipher what's going on inside us. It's very hard to find words for it, and therefore it can also be hard to come out of the trigger. I know for myself that there are certain things that can trigger me into quite a traumatized state, and earlier I wouldn't know what it was and I wouldn't know how to help myself. So as always, I hope that by sharing a little bit, it provides some insight and illumination for some of you to make sense of your experience and find a way to shift it or to change it. So when I go into a trauma trigger, different ones can happen. I know that when somebody around me in my sphere expresses anger, I go into a very, very deep trigger. So for me, when I was young, anger was a precursor to harm, either emotional harm or physical harm. But I think that for me, the trigger is around physical harm. So when somebody expresses anger, even if it does dissipate, what happens in me is quite complex. First of all, there is a bracing through my chest and my hips. There's this real tightening. There's a closing of my breath, of my diaphragm, and my heart starts to beat very, very, very quickly. And it also feels like my connection to the world changes a bit. It feels a bit like I'm frozen in time, and then the world is occurring around me. And I know now, through a lot of self-work and working in the field I do, that my body is experiencing potential threat of physical harm. And it used to be that I would go into that state and stay in that state, and then that could lead to different things, either disconnecting and not being able to engage at all, or feeling quite hysterical, as a young child would be that's being threatened of harm. Now I know when it occurs what it is, and I know how to remove myself from the situation and bring myself to safety. So being able to express and create a boundary is something that we probably were not able to do in the face of the actual trauma. And I think it's really important to know that in our adult life, we can actually say, no, this isn't okay for me, and walk away. And it can feel terrifying in itself to actually do that, because again, if we tie it back to the original trauma experience, probably to set a boundary would have been met with more harm. So number one is to be able to notice it. Number two is to be able to set a boundary and remove ourselves from the experience where we are experiencing perceived threat. And I think this is really important to express as well. When we are having a complex post-traumatic trauma response, the threat is perceived and it's not necessarily real. And this can feel, again, very, very confusing, because there's the experience of what is real here, what is real here, are the two the same, are they not? And this again can create this feeling of not having any ground beneath us and not knowing what is up or down, real or false. So number one is to have awareness. Number two is to be empowered to disconnect from the source that is causing the trauma trigger. And I think that one can be quite hard to do. Number three will be to do what you need to do to help yourself feel much safer. And depending on what's going on in your nervous system, the self-care tools that you may need to bring yourself to safety may be different. So if your heart is racing and it's more of a fight or flight experience, you may need something that is grounding and calming. Whereas if you kind of freeze up and kind of disassociate, you probably need something that's going to enliven and engage you. What can be common as well is to have both responses at once, and this is known as a co-activated or disorganized response. So it can feel like you want to fight or flight, but you also want to shut down and freeze. And I think being aware of that is also helpful in determining what self-care tools that we want to use to manage ourselves and help ourselves find safety. And there's an article on my website called Relational Triggers Maps to Safety, and I would love to recommend you, if you're interested in this topic, to pop over and have a look at the website. The link is in the comments. But basically there are different things that we might need to access safety. It might be that we need space. It might be that we need to reach out to someone. It might need that we need to create order around us because we can feel very unstable and that feeling like the world is spinning around us. Anything we can do to connect to stability will really, really help. Now, all of us have our own different trauma triggers and we can respond very differently as well. So taking time to inquire what are the things that send you into this very overwhelmed state and understand the thread back to why that might be is really, really important. A lot of our triggers do come within relationships, so working on this will not only help us understand ourselves and learn to self-regulate, but it will help us engage with a lot more awareness and grace in our relationships. I hope this sharing has been useful, and I'd love to hear what your experience is of your trauma triggers. If you know what they are, if you're having trouble making sense, you're welcome to comment below or DM me.